we're very honored and pleased to have some professionals here to offer you their expertise in understanding the health-related issues to our science building problems. And so without further ado, in fact, I'm sorry, what we're going to do is have Patricia Beach, Dr. Feinstein, myself, and then Ron in that order, and then Sean Whalen will be moderating the Q&A session at the end. So again, welcome. I know that this is obviously a significant issue for the campus. And again, throughout, back when I returned to the microphones, I just want to continue to thank everyone for the incredible patience and reactions to the science building closure, but more importantly, to the incredible commitment to servicing the students as the semester began. It really was overwhelming for me and for many that watched everyone do really concerted, focused, and collaborative work. So again, thanks to everyone on campus. It is my honor to introduce to you Patricia Beach. She is a certified industrial hygienist. She has extensive experience in recognition, evaluation, and control of hazards in the workplace and the environment. And she has spent her entire career in the practice of environmental toxicology and the interaction of industrial chemicals with concerns for human health. She has quite an impeccable record and degrees and those kinds of things. I think the more important thing would be to hear directly from her than to have me read to you the list of accomplishments on her part. So without further ado, Patricia.
Thank you, President Wong, and thanks for those who invited me here to help shed some light on some of the very important questions that have been brought up on campus about the science building closure. Let's see. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I think in this type of situation it's very important for people to be able to ask a lot of questions, and I'm sure you have questions that you want to bring up. But I'm going to just touch on the hazards that have been identified in the building and a little bit about how those hazards were found and what this means for potential exposure to those who occupy the building. And when I'm talking about occupants or building occupants, I'm going to largely be referring to those who have worked and used the building for a number of years, so faculty, staff, students. I think visitors to the building are, as I'll state later, less of a concern from a health risk perspective, so I'm focusing on those who basically, that's their place of work, the science building. For anybody who has very specific concerns about your particular exposure situation in the building, Dr. Fischman and I will be happy to address those immediately after the town hall. So I'm going to focus a little bit, or focus on the data in the building, how it was collected and what it means from exposure potential. And then Dr. Michael Fishman is going to address specifically the medical aspects that you might be concerned about. Okay, what was identified? I know this one, thank you, sorry. There are lots of reports and documents available on the public website that the university has put out that I'm sure many of you have reviewed and have questions on. But I'm gonna highlight what the key hazards were that were identified. So lead and asbestos. Not surprising in a structure that was built in the 1940s. Pretty much every building built in this time frame does contain lead and asbestos. Visual inspection by the consultant in December and January found that this is indeed the case, and there were some of those materials that do need repair. Mercury was identified in some laboratories in specific drains, and I believe some users of those labs had confirmed that some mercury had spilled. And just to focus that I'm going to talk about lead, asbestos, and mercury really from here on out, because those are the materials that are of most prevalence in the building, and from my perspective, probably present the most concern for those that have raised questions. There were additional heavy metals that were identified: chromium, nickel, arsenic, antimony, lead, mercury. These were largely related to in the chemistry areas and in the artifact areas. I think they're fairly isolated, as are the PCBs that were found on one sample. And there was some evidence of water damage noted. So with the exception of lead, asbestos, and mercury, I'm not going to spend much time on these other items that were found, because I believe they were isolated and can be managed fairly straightforward manner as the lead and asbestos gets managed in the building. So the final report of the consultant was posted on February 11th, so just Tuesday, and I've spent quite a bit of time reviewing this document and all the data that is contained therein. It's very clearly stated that that report is intended to assist in decisions for building cleanup. I completely agree that that's the best use of that report. The data is not intended to be used to determine health risk for those occupying the building. And I will spend a little bit of time explaining why I think that's the case. And the fact that the data is almost entirely from targeted wipe samples is one of the reasons. So I'll talk a little bit more about wipe sampling in context to health hazard and health risk. So wipe sample data really, in evaluating human health risk, is not a good indicator of potential exposure or health effects. Because the hazards found, so lead, asbestos, and mercury, tend to be poorly absorbed by the skin. Hazards found, when they're found on surfaces, they're not necessarily or easily airborne. And this is important because, as we'll talk about, inhalation, breathing in chemicals, is by far the most prevalent pathway of human exposure in a work setting like this. And it's difficult to get dust up in the air during routine operations. Further, it's difficult to associate a direct dose to the body from skin contact. There's lots of information out there that that's the case. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but further, the wipe samples that were collected specifically in dusty areas that were meant to help identify hazards in that dust. So a lot of the dust that was sampled is not necessarily readily available for people to be exposed to. It had been sitting there for quite some time, and the intent of the sample was to find out what's in that dust. You know, not how somebody might contact or get exposed to that dust. So exposure. So I'm going to talk a little bit next about exposure principles and why my conclusion after looking at all this data is that health risk based on simply being in the building is minimal to low for those who just routinely occupy it. So I think it's important for everyone to be on the same page in terms of what health risk is, or how it's calculated in the world of risk assessment. Simply put, health risk is hazard times an exposure. The hazard in this case are the chemicals that have been identified in the dust in the building. The exposure has yet to be really defined. And based on what I'm going to say, I don't think that there is much to worry about if you've worked in this building. So exposure itself is, in order to be exposed to a chemical, you have to have that chemical available, whether however that is, whether it's for ingestion or dermal contact or inhalation. And then it actually has to get into your body to cause harm. So how do we make assumptions or calculate what a health risk is? And I'm not going to go into any more math than this, I promise. I just wanted you to be aware of what we do when we're determining health risk, because we have to have an understanding of not only the hazard, which I think people understand the hazard. I think people know and hear that lead and asbestos and mercury, there's some inherent hazard just by the nature of those chemicals. But how would you actually get it into your body to cause harm? And this is the science of human health risk assessment. So we make assumptions, essentially. It's an imprecise science, to be sure. But we make assumptions on people's contact rate with the material, how frequently they're exposed, how long they're exposed. Assumptions are made about body weight and averaging time. And because we have to make these assumptions, the intent is to make very conservative or health-based assumptions in order to make sure that we don't underestimate potential health risk. And I think some of the criteria that was used in the report that was put out on February 11th, a couple days ago, does that. They use conservative health assumptions. And I just want to really reiterate some of the items that are in the report already. And I just wanted to my point of this slide really is to help you see that there are no documented dermal values for asbestos. The values that we can use for screening level on surfaces are, they're considered guidances. And so we use conservative numbers in order to make sure we don't underestimate exposure. But guidance is not, a mandate, unlike the air samples that were collected and that were screened against. Air sampling, air samples are compared against known safe levels that are in our state governed by the California Occupational Safety and Health Administration at these levels that are listed here. We don't have a lot of information in the initial report about air monitoring. And I'm going to touch on that and tell you a little bit about what data we do have since that report has been published. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, how do you get exposed to a chemical? Well, there's really three primary routes. You inhale it, you absorb it through your skin, or you ingest it. And in a work setting, like we are here at San Francisco State in the Science Building, inhalation is by far the most common and prevalent way that people get exposed to chemicals at work. Absorption and ingestion are distant pathways compared to inhalation. So with that said, and I'm asking you to take that as a truth because it is the truth. For significant exposure to occur, I wanted to go explain more detail about why that is, but it is, and I know Dr. Fischman's going to talk a little bit more about that as well. But simply put, for a significant exposure to occur, the hazard needs to be in the air. So what air data do we have so far? And we do have some, fortunately. When this situation came to light, some additional people got involved prior to my involvement in this project and began collecting air samples in the building. And this is what we have to date as I prepared these slides just yesterday. So asbestos, we've collected, or they've collected, and these are the people doing the abatement work right now, the cleaning your materials, actually physically handling dusty items, doing some cleanup in the facility itself. We've had no detections of any asbestos fibers out of so far 9 samples collected, and we're well below the regulatory limit. So that's actually good news for not only the people collecting or working with the materials in the facility, but also I think for those of you who have occupied the building. Same with lead. There was one small detection of lead in the Hohenthal Gallery, hope I said that correctly, just above the detection limit. The 13 out of the 12 other samples for lead were not detected above the detection limit. And as you can see, the one sample that was detected was well below the criteria that this is the 30 micrograms per cubic meter is actually an action level. It's a bit lower than the permissible level, but it's well below what the state considers acceptable for people at work exposed to lead. And mercury, in the general environment for the 8 samples collected, 2 of them were collected in where we knew, or where they knew mercury spills had occurred, room 169 and rooms 111. And those 2 concentrations were still well below what's considered acceptable by the state of California. So this is what the air data says as of today, which I find very, very encouraging, because when I first got involved with this evaluation, I was like, well, where's the air data? Because we inherently know that inhalation is the main route of exposure. Trying to correlate white data, as I said before, is very, very difficult. So I'm going to wrap it up here and then introduce Dr. Michael Fishman to talk about specific health impacts. But my conclusion at this point, after many hours in a short amount of time reviewing what is available, that the wipe sample data that we have to date is helpful in defining where and how to clean up the structure, where to target, where to focus first, which I'll say right now I think is in the chemistry area on the first floor. And then the air sample data really is the most meaningful, in my opinion, and in my perspective, for demonstrating potential health risk. And given that we're not seeing the material in the air, that adverse health impacts are unlikely to occur for people attending class, visiting, or working in the science building. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there, and I have the honor also to introduce Dr. Michael Fishman. He is a consulting physician in occupational environmental medicine and toxicology with the Fischman Occupational Environmental Medical Group in Walnut Creek. He is a graduate with a master's in public health from the Environmental Health Sciences School of Public Health at UC Berkeley. He did a residency training in internal medicine and in occupational medicine at UCSF, and he's board certified in both fields. He's a clinical professor of medicine at UCSF, and he is an attending physician and serves as an assistant chief of division occupational environmental medicine. He's also a co-author of a textbook, which is titled Chemical Hazards of the Workplace, and author or co-author of a number of book chapters, including building-associated illness. So I think he can address the specific health concerns in regards to the hazards. Dr. Fischman.
Thanks, Patty. Patty's made my work a little bit easier for me because she covered a lot of the material that I think needs to be covered, allowing me really to just focus in on the potential that there might be any health risk. Well, I normally don't have that problem, maybe. You know, the main focus here for the presentation is to focus on, you know, whether there might be any health risk associated with people being and working within the building. That's what I'm going to focus on. Patty's covered a lot of the other material. I think before I really start, I just wanted to share some perspective. I've been doing this kind of work for approximately 30 years, starting when I was in training. In the course of that work, I've been involved in a number of investigations of problem buildings. I've also worked in supporting and evaluating concerns about exposure in industrial settings where exposure levels oftentimes are or potential exposure levels are oftentimes much higher than here, and there's more chemical use than what there actually is in this building environment. So, clearly there's some problems here. They need to be remediated, cleaned, fixed, and I'm not trying to discount that, but as you'll see, having reviewed all of the available information, I don't think that there is a significant health concern for those of you who worked in the building, and I don't think there's a need to do any medical testing at this point, and I'll go through why I think that in a moment. So, got to get used to this. So, again, Patty covered some of this, but she talked about how you determine risk, and that is all correct. Really what we're talking about in terms of assessing health risk is what might be the dose that somebody sustained from being in the building. And because the dose determines the health risk. You can have all kinds of hazardous materials present, but if it doesn't get into your body, it's not going to cause a problem. The dose is the amount that's absorbed into the body, whether you breathe it in, whether you consume it accidentally or on purpose, or from skin contact. And again, as Patty mentioned, the inhalation is the most important route of exposure in almost all occupational settings or academic settings or anywhere else for adults. That's not always true for kids, but for adults, that's the important route of exposure. And for inhalation, the dose is equal to the air concentration times the duration of exposure, or times the time during which somebody might be exposed. So if you're, the concentration on average is a certain value, and you worked 5 days a week, 8 hours a day in that setting for 10 years, then you can estimate the dose by multiplying that average concentration by the amount of time you spent in the environment. And exposure assessment is what's used to try to determine the exposure, and from that to determine the dose. And that particularly is Patty's expertise, but I have a lot of experience in that area as well. And then you look at published peer-reviewed scientific studies to determine what's the relationship between a dose and a health effect. So we know that just from common experience that a certain level of exposure, or dose rather, potentially results in a health effect. And I like to give this example, with alcohol, drinking alcohol. You know that if you consume a bottle of vodka, you're going to be passed out. You're going to have significant health effects. On the other side, if you take a drop of vodka and put it on your tongue, most people are not going to have any manifestations from that. And then there's a gradation of response depending upon what the dose is. And fundamentally, that same logic or thinking applies to other chemical exposures, the kinds that we're talking about here, which are primarily lead and asbestos, and to a lesser degree, mercury. And again, the information that we use comes from scientific studies and that are published in the toxicology and medical literature, and from studies that, from summaries or reviews of those studies and published risk assessments. So I think we've covered this enough, and I'll just skip through it. Inhalation exposure is the predominant route. Not saying that there wasn't skin exposure or a possibility for ingestion, but they likely play a minor part in terms of what dose someone might sustain. So these are busy slides, but as Patty already mentioned, the air sampling results were non-detectable essentially, or at extremely low levels, and that's true for the asbestos and lead, and it's also true for the mercury. So if the exposures are low, remember the dose is equal to the concentration, or the exposure times the time. If the exposure is zero, or the concentration is zero, no matter how long you're exposed, your dose is still essentially zero. And the the way in which these samples were collected, some people might say, well, nobody was in the building, so what do these air samples tell you about what it was like when people were in the building? But, and some of you may know this, the approach to sampling was to try to mimic what it would be like to have people in and working in the building. So they moved paper around. They, people were walking around in the area while the sample was collected. So in general, it should be representative of what exposures were like for the majority of people when they were working in the building. So again, to emphasize what Patty said, the surface sampling results they're important in terms of telling you what kind of problem do we have in terms of contamination and what do we need to do to clean it up and where is it so we can focus our efforts to clean it up. But they really don't tell you anything about health risk. Obviously, if it's there and it gets disturbed and it gets into the air, it can possibly lead to a dose, and that dose could be associated with a risk, but it has to get into the air. So if it's just sitting on surfaces and it doesn't get into the air, again, it doesn't pose a health hazard because there's no absorbed dose. So the other contaminants, as Patty mentioned, were at very low levels and wouldn't be likely at all to pose any kind of health risk. And I won't go into the detail. I can cover this during the question and answer session, but obviously lead and asbestos and mercury and some of these other contaminants, they can have very serious health effects if the dose is high. But the dose needs to be high. If the dose is zero, there's obviously no risk for a health effect. And what we know from the investigation is that the airborne air concentrations were non-detect from these samples, and therefore one would expect that the exposure was near zero or zero and the dose would be zero, so therefore there's no potential for health effects. I know some of you had expressed a good question, which is, okay, so I got this stuff on me potentially. I rubbed up against surfaces where there was lead or there was asbestos, and it got on my clothes, and then I went home and I was playing with my kids. Maybe they got some on them. And it's a good question. In this context, though, it is not at all likely to pose a health risk to the individual or to their child or to other family members. And there are settings where, though, it is a possible concern. So if you were an asbestos insulation worker who removed or installed asbestos in shipyards, in Navy ships, for example, people were covered in dust. People would describe that it looked like it was snowing in these rooms, and they'd have dust all over them, which contained asbestos fibers. And they would take their clothes home, and someone in the home would shake those clothes out to try and get the dust off, and then they'd wash the clothes. And clearly those people who did that, or their kids who were standing around, had an opportunity to have exposure to air concentrations that were not zero, and then to have some potential health risk. Most of those people wouldn't develop a problem, but there is the possibility of that because there's an exposure. Here we're talking about low levels of contaminants on surfaces, and even lower levels that might have gotten onto clothing, and then that clothing gets taken home. And that kind of situation is not something that has resulted in health problems in individuals at home. I did some work years ago with individuals that worked in a lead battery manufacturing plant. These were batteries at that time that were for use in computers, and that was very poorly controlled, and people were covered in dust, and they were taking their clothes home to be washed. And so there, in that case, was the opportunity that family members could be exposed to lead, which would not be a good thing. But in this case, we're talking about low levels of lead on surfaces that are not likely to get on clothes, and to the extent that they do, and they do get taken home, they're not likely to pose a problem. Lead is a concern for kids, and I'm not just counting it. The big concern with lead in homes, either because of lead paint that peels off or lead brought home from some process, is that kids are playing on the floor where the lead dust tends to settle. They may be wiping their hands on windowsills where the paint is peeling. And then, as some of you know who have kids, kids tend to put their hands in their mouth. They don't always wash their hands beforehand, and they wind up ingesting flakes of lead paint. And they can develop high levels of lead in their blood, the high blood lead levels. And that, can and does pose a risk. I know some of you may have brought your kids to work, but probably they weren't crawling around on the floor 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 24 hours a day here. And the levels here, of course, are much lower than typically would be found in an older home that has a contaminated with lead-based paint. So it is, all these are concerns that you can think about, but Patty and I have carefully reviewed the information and come away with the notion that there is not a likelihood of exposure and therefore not a dose and therefore not likely to be health effects. So the last thing I want to cover is talking about possible medical testing. I know this question has been raised. Those of you who are aware of this know that asbestos workers, insulation workers, or lead remediation workers, they do undergo testing, medical testing and screening, sometimes to look for levels of the material in their blood, like blood lead levels, sometimes to look for possible health effects. So the asbestos worker might get a chest x-ray and a breathing test periodically to make sure that they're not experiencing effects from that. Those kinds of problems result from high levels of exposure and high doses of the material. And because we don't have that here, there really isn't a medical indication or a medical reason for conducting tests, at least for the large majority of folks who are doing routine kinds of work in the building. There may be other situations if someone was working with the asbestos containing materials on pipes and cutting them and doing things without proper precautions, they would have had an opportunity for more exposure, and we have to think about that further. But for the majority of people, there was little or no opportunity for exposure, so you're wasting your time going for medical testing in this situation. And you can even think about the potential adverse effects of the testing. So if you go for a chest x-ray, you get exposed to x-rays, ionizing radiation. Not a lot, but a little bit. And you might find something that is unrelated to the exposure in the building, and that may force somebody, lung doctor, to do some additional invasive testing on you. So testing and screening is not free of its own set of problems, and so if it's not necessary, I don't encourage people to do it. I'm not saying you can't do it or you shouldn't do it if you have particular concerns, but I don't really think it's necessary, and it's not going to be helpful in terms of understanding whether or not you have a health problem now, and it's not going to be helpful in understanding whether or not you are at risk for some health problem down the line. It's just not going to be useful. Again, we'll consider special groups or specific questions from groups at the end of the meeting, and we may, if we need to, meet with groups of individuals, like say the facilities technicians who did some work where they might have disturbed some of this material in a more significant way compared to most of you who worked in the building. And so the public health recommendations, the Cal-OSHA rules, they don't apply in this situation. And I think I'll stop here. Went a little longer than I intended to, but I think we have plenty of time for questions at this point.
Hey, Dr. Fischman, an apology. I think I might have massacred your name when I first mentioned it earlier. My apologies. I'm only going to take just a moment because we took the concern seriously, as you're hearing. We tried to work expeditiously and openly and transparently. And so again, I encourage you to go to the website, to take a look at the information that our two professionals have posted, as well as the reports from the consultants used up to date with the building. I thought it might be interesting for you to see the amount, some metrics about the amount of effort taken by a number of people. I had originally turned to Sean and said, God, let's put everybody's name on there that worked diligently, and it dawned on both of us that every employee at the university and every student name would probably have to be put on there. But this will give you a good idea that roughly 6,000 students, roughly about 9,000 enrollments were influenced by the closure of the building, 250 faculty and staff, those directly involved in helping us manage the loss to the building. As you can see, roughly 450. Class sections moved 235, class sections canceled 2. And I share this with you not with the intent that things are hunky-dory and we should feel good about it. There are lots of warts when you make these many changes in the curriculum and you get people moving to different locations. You don't have tables and chairs, nor privacy for faculty conversations with their students. All of that is ongoing. And so I don't in any way want to have you think that we're happy, smiling, and everyone's perfect in Minnesota. That's just not the way it is. People are working very, very hard to minimize the amount of impact on the curriculum, et cetera. And I suspect that there will continue to be problems as we move towards the middle of the semester and many of the laboratories for chemistry and engineering have to begin. And we hope that those facilities will be in place by that time. So again, I wanted to just, in a very direct way, give my thanks to a lot of the folks, the staff that are sitting in the front, that we had them come up so that in case there are questions, that they can respond to them in addition to questions posed to our two professionals. At this point, what I'd like to do is ask Ron Cortez to come on up, Vice President for Administration and Finance, and I think he wants to offer some comment as well. But again, I just wanted to take this moment to express my appreciation. I have been keeping the Chancellor and his staff informed. It almost seems like about every day in the evening or every other day, he and I are exchanging comments about what to do, what he wants to know. And it's been good for me, too, because he's a scientist, and he was asking for lots of data and also took a look at our site. And so, again, we're trying to keep the Chancellor's folks informed as well. Again, my last pitch is for you to go to the website. This presentation today will be put on the website at the conclusion of today, and we will continue to respond to questions and issues as they come in. The EOC is continually monitoring input. Jean is producing summaries of the day or 2 days' activities for my desk every 48 hours. So we are trying to keep everybody informed and getting the information out to you. That was probably the most dominant, most frequent response by employees and students was transparency. You know, put what you know out there on the web, and we have endeavored to do that. I hope you appreciate that. So, Ron, would you like to?
Thank you, President Wong. For those who don't know me, my name is Ron Cortez. I'm the Vice President. Excuse me. I'm the Vice President of Administration and Finance, and I oversee the Environmental Health and Safety Department. So one of the things that's of utmost importance to our division is the health and safety of our campus community. For your background, I was prior to coming to San Francisco State University, I was the Deputy CEO for the County of Santa Barbara and oversaw the safety program for 10 years. And prior to my arrival here at San Francisco State University, I was the Associate Vice Chancellor overseeing environmental health and safety for 5.5 years with about 800 labs. So I think the whole division is really interested and concerned about the safety of our campus community, and that's the perspective in which we looked at this particular issue. So I think it's important for us to understand what caused the closure and what are our next steps to make sure that we have an operable science building for our campus. So here's sort of a little bit of the background of what occurred, and some of this you've already seen that's on the website. But our campus is required to do a hazardous waste material inventory. It's required by the San Francisco Department of Public Health. And as part of that audit, it's required that we actually confirm the types and quantities of hazardous waste that we have on our campus. And that's the process that was taking place when we discovered a photo lab that had chemicals in it. Part of our EH&S director's responsibility to determine who is responsible or who's the owner of that, so that we can make sure that we complete the documents in the proper form. As they went and did their inquiry around the science building and talked to the building coordinators and the safety representatives, they discovered a report that had taken place in the year 2000 and year 2001. Actually, there's two reports, and had done a survey in which mercury had been found. The question by our environmental health and safety director was that had that been remediated. So they began to do their testing in the basement in rooms 2 and 2A, discovered levels of mercury, and closed that particular room down. They then broadened their inspection to then inspect the entire basement. A consultant confirmed that there were readings of mercury in the basement, in which they then closed that down. The reports that were from 2000, 2001 also talked about mercury and other contaminants in the first and third floor. Also, I forgot to mention, in the basement there was visual identification of TSI asbestos that had been deteriorated or had been damaged during repair. So that broadened the scope of the testing to the other areas of the building to ensure that there were not damaged TSI or deteriorated TSI at other parts of the building that could cause contamination. And that then expanded the amount of testing that was done in the first, second, and third floors. And let's see, do we have our little, okay. Yeah, let's go to our next slide. So as we, wait, go back to the previous one just one second. So as we did this, we first basically started with the closure of the basement. Then later, we closed 7 rooms for additional testing. And then finally, we closed the building. There's 2 reasons, really, that from our perspective, that we recommended the building be closed. First, we were concerned about the health and safety of the campus community that was entering the building. Second, we were concerned about our ability to remediate the building in a safe way once the issue had been identified. And I think anyone who looks at that building, or at least from my perspective, there is some significant repairs, or I would say deferred maintenance, that needs to be repaired on that building. Those were some of the 2 reasons that we were looking at it. So it was not just health and safety, but it was health and safety and health and safety during remediation. So let's go. Next slide. Okay, so here's where we are at this particular time. We have the continue to remove items. We're initiating an initial asbestos lead survey to determine how much repair needs to be completed in the building before people can re-enter. In other words, what's the scope of the TSI repair that needs to be done, and how can we repair the mercury as well. Next, there are some other buildings on campus that have TSI or lead in them. We don't know if it's any contamination. So in those particular buildings, we're actually doing an assessment. I know some of you have been concerned about that, and I'll talk about which buildings later. But we want to make sure that everyone in our campus community is safe. And we're glad to hear good news like we heard earlier this afternoon. In the end of February, we'll also have Dr. Fischman and Patty will complete their assessment. And then we're going to determine the scope and cost of the repair of the science building. And then we're going to develop short, medium, and long-term plans, and I'll expound upon that in just a second. These are the buildings that we're going to have an environmental assessment performed on, and I believe this assessment will begin on Monday. We're going to be looking at the business building, the creative arts building, fine arts, gymnasium, HSS, Mary Park Hall, and Mary Ward Hall. And the reason we picked these buildings is because there has not been any construction or renovation before the lead paint of 1978, and also before TSI was regulated in 1981, and those were banned. That's why these particular buildings were picked as our first phase. Next. Next, here are some of the options of where we go from here. Our staff is now reviewing our cleaning is one option, repair is one option, renovate and replace. I'm sure many of you work in the old science building, and some of you have been in the old science building, but in our opinion, I don't know if anyone could argue we need a new science building, and regardless of where we are today. And I've talked a little bit to Sheldon about this, and also I've talked to the president about this and the provost about trying to develop a work program and to develop a design of what a new building would actually look like. And I think that's important for us to think about the future, because we need to be able to have a long-term plan as where we go from here. So what we don't want to have happen, I believe in the long term, is that we basically wipe the original building clean and move in and continue to believe that the existing conditions are okay. But we want to improve the situation in the working environment. I've had a chance to look at that building. I know other people have had a chance to look at that building, and we want to work to make things better for our campus community. So with that, I think that's all that I have. I'd just like to leave it there, is that there's been a lot of work by this campus community to pull it together. I know a lot of you out there have gone to tremendous sacrifice to move your classes and to teach your students, and so that is much appreciated. I just want to let you know that we have a commitment to our health and safety of the campus community and take it seriously, and we didn't want anybody to go back into that building until we were convinced overwhelmingly that that building was safe. And I think we have gone through a process that has brought us to a point today where I think that's good news, and we're glad to hear that as well. So I thank you very much.
All right, we've got about 40 minutes left for questions, and I hope that those of you that have questions will come to the front and ask the questions on the microphone. We're recording this presentation and these questions on video so that your colleagues can watch this who couldn't join us if they were teaching or attending class. A couple of things I want to start with to make sure everybody knows. After this event, sometime hopefully before the end of today, we'll upload all of the PowerPoints that were presented here so that you can refer back to them. There'll also be the video of this meeting and eventually a captioned version of this video of this meeting on the website. A summary of a document about the health effects that you might have experienced that's prepared by Dr. Fischman will be up there as well, that you can share with your physician if you felt the need. As well as a FAQ related to health issues that is a collaborative effort between Patty Beach and Michael Fishman. All right, a couple of sort of ground rules for the questions, and I don't see anyone lining up yet, so I'll continue to talk. We've really liked to address the initial questions. We're hoping that they'll come from our students, faculty, and staff directly. We've asked that folks from the media, wait until after. We're going to keep not only the 4 people you see on stage here, but any number of folks who have put in tons of effort and know the exact on-the-ground sort of answers to some of the particular questions that you might have here after the event today, to answer questions, both of media, and also for those of you who have questions that maybe aren't of general interest, but have very unique sort of circumstances. You work in a particular location and want to share that with either Dr. Fischman or Ms. Beach, and you know, you just want to talk one-on-one. So we have that available too after our 2:30 stop time. So I see question number 1.
All right, my name is Nicolo Calderero, and in the year 2000, we organized a conference here for Native American tribes to examine the issue of them receiving their ceremonial objects and burials back from the federal government, and knowing that they were contaminated with various pesticides and other things. And during the process of that, we did test some objects in our museum in anthropology, and my colleagues Lee Davis and Pete Palmer, we published those results in a number of peer-reviewed journals. And it's sort of interesting to see. I always want to see my papers read, but it's amazing 13 years later to actually see them still have some relevance. In this case, though, one of the things that I was concerned about was that we notified the university then about our findings, and then apparently there was a licensed, reputable company that came in and did testing, verified that there were chemicals of various sorts in the building, and the building was supposedly remediated at that time. And that's I don't really understand what happened with that, but I do feel I have 40 years of experience working with museums. I worked at the DeYoung, the Legion of Honor, the California Academy of Sciences, the Whitney Museum, and many other. I'm a member of the American Institute for Conservation, and I'm hired by Heritage Preservation to examine buildings and their collections for appropriateness. And I've never seen a building closed down before. I was shocked when it happened. Usually a plan is developed, the building is remediated when the risk is identified. I'm very happy to see your reports. But I'm thinking about the future now, and I really want to know, and I'm sort of frightened when I'm here, concerned when I hear that other buildings are going to be tested, and I would be really concerned about that the collections, because there has been some information about the collections being a source. We in museums routinely handle polluted collections, and it's not a real problem we have worked out. I was hired by the state of California to teach Native American tribes and museums how to deal with polluted collections, and we've developed procedures, and collections are learning documents of the past, and that the fact that they have pesticides on them has allowed them to be preserved to the present. So there's no way that I know of getting rid of the pesticides. However, if they're considered to be a problem, we might as well bomb all of our museums and set the collections on fire. We're scientists. We should be able to organize procedures on campus defined by OSHA. They're all there about how to handle the problems that we have around collections. I really would hate to see another building closed like this. And I really question whether the schedule that I saw is necessary to keep the building closed another day, given the report on the testing.
All right, I'm going to ask Vice President Cortez to respond to the question, and in particular maybe to address whether or not the building and the contamination was related exclusively to the artifacts.
Is this working?
Yep.
Okay, great. So in answer to your question about the unusualness of the closing of the building, maybe I can just talk to you a little bit about the process that went through. As I mentioned before, the campus hired a consultant, AWS, to do testing and to provide information to the campus. They actually were the consultant who recommended to the campus that we actually close the actual science building. The campus then hired another consultant to verify the closure of the building. We actually have that in writing too, that recommend that that it was prudent for the campus to close until a risk assessment could be performed. So I think that was the report and a confirmation. The second consultant recommended, just as we talked about earlier, more air testing, and that's how we could determine the health and safety of the building. And they're actually the ones who performed the air testing that our doctor and our Patty is looking at now. So, but both consultants at the time said until we had more information and we had a risk assessment performed, that it was prudent for us to close the building. Secondly, in answer to your question about how we deal with future buildings, we actually have developed a scope of work, and Dr. Fischman and Patty have actually reviewed that scope of work about what the consultants will actually review and how that work will be conducted in the additional buildings.
Thank you.
One other quick thing, I want to say that we solicited some questions from people when we announced the meeting who could not be here today, and this is somewhat related to the artifacts question. There was a question asked of us about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and our compliance with it with the building closed. And I just wanted to let everyone know, and the person that asked that question, that we are quite aware. It was one of the first concerns that we had, that we had artifacts that are governed by NAGPRA, and I believe Dean Sherwin and Associate Dean Shimanoff and our NAGPRA coordinator have already been meeting to talk about ways to deal with compliance. All right, next question.
Okay, my name is Michael Goldman. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Physics and Astronomy. I'm here to express the fact that I'm extremely critical, and I think I'm not alone in the way that the administration has handled the whole problem of the closure of the science building. And one of the areas that's not even been mentioned today where I'm extremely critical is the research of the affected faculty. I could go on the whole afternoon giving examples of my criticism, but I'll just limit myself to one that kind of sets the tone. In the previous town hall meeting, President Wong said that he compared the closure of the science building with the Hurricane Katrina, and he sort of used that to suggest that funding agencies would be lenient because they had been lenient, when Hurricane Katrina hit. I'd like to point out that this was not a natural disaster. The closure of the science building is a direct consequence of what I would call gross negligence on the side of the university. So if I'm a granting agency and I look at that, my conclusion would be that serious research at San Francisco State is not possible, and I would pull the plug. That's another possible interpretation of what might happen. So I think there are a bunch of things that the administration needs to start thinking about, and two of those are, one, I would like to see a committee appointed that includes faculty from all the affected departments, okay, that gets full information to everything that happened, and that works directly with those in the administration level that make the decisions on what's going on and get involved in solving these problems. The process of even recovering material from the science building has been taking way too long. And then the other thing, I think less urgent but equally important, I would like to see some independent panel appointed that does a full investigation, gets full information on everything that happened, and does a full investigation on how we got in this place, what kind of mismanagement led to the closure of the science building over these many years, and also a full investigation on how the administration handled the situation, because I think it's been incredibly bad. Okay, thank you.
Not sure that there was a question there as much as that was a statement, and I just want to make sure that I'm not missing a question. All right, next question.
Hello, not used to my voice being so magnified. My name is Kane. I'm a junior representative on the ASI Board of Directors here, but today I don't speak as a student representative, I speak as a concerned student. And I just have a couple of questions for you, and I want to first thank you for being transparent in this matter, seeing the concentrations and seeing that there may not be as big a health effect on students and faculty is very reassuring, considering that we have faculty members that have been in that building for 20 years, and myself who's been in that building for the last 4. I just wanted to inquire as to why the building was not tested at a sooner date. I mean, even those levels of mercury and asbestos and lead, if they were tested on a regular basis, I don't think we'd be in this situation. So if any of you can speak to that, as well as what techniques and remediations are you doing to prevent this in future buildings? Because I don't think any of us want another building to be closed down, classes to be canceled and rearranged, as it is kind of put a lot of stoppers on the amount of education and the quality of education students and faculty can provide. Thank you.
Thanks. Vice President Cortez, do you want to?
I can't speak so much to how this occurred just because, in the past, but I can speak to the future and the fact that we are doing an inspection of all the buildings that have similar characteristics and identifying those areas that need to be repaired. I mean, we have to be honest and look at that building, and at least my initial observation is there's still a lot of repairs that need to be done to fix that. So I guess what we have to do is continue to, there's two different types of processes that I think that need to be reviewed and updated. One is in environmental health and safety to make sure we have our proper inspections. I think we talked about that earlier. My past experience working at a UC campus, I think we need to have more stringent program in that area. And secondly, I think our deferred maintenance program in that area needs to be reviewed in the future. So I don't want to speak to the past, but I can speak to the future and say with the commitment, those two areas need to be reviewed and addressed so that we can not have this situation happen in the future.
So you have no comment on how the building got to this situation?
Well, I'm only going to comment, in fact, I've been here about 6 months. I'm not going to comment past the 6 months I've been here, but I can just tell you my initial observation. I think it goes back to my honest and candid statement that I made up there when I was at the podium, and the fact that we need to do something to address the long-term needs of the old science building. When we look at, I just only compare about my observations of my previous experience in looking at the facility here, and I want to help the campus move forward to get a new facility or renovated facility, because I think we're hearing two different things. One is the safety of the building and people moving in, and I think there's also a second one, which is the adequacy of the building to be maintained and be safe. And I think those two require long-term thinking. I talked already to Sheldon Axter, the dean, and talked about beginning our programming process to look at what a new building would look like and even how we'd renovate in the interim to make things and conditions better.
So I'll add real quickly as well that the question of causation is one that's very complex and is one that is not forgotten, but it's one that we're not likely to be able to make any conclusions. I don't think you've heard anyone up here talk about what the causes were. Mm-hmm. There's some indication that artifacts may have contributed some of the contaminants. It's also some indication that asbestos wrap of the HVAC systems might have contributed. There's also some speculation that lead paint might have contributed, and figuring out what caused those things is a much more complex process. And at this portion of the work that we've done, we wanted to first make sure that we got everybody out of the building so that people weren't needlessly in harm's way. Then we looked at relocating everyone so that they weren't massively inconvenienced and we didn't have to cancel many classes. And now we're dealing with the somewhat less massive inconvenience that results from not having this facility online. When causation is an enormously important part of what the work ahead is, it has to do with insurance as well as answering the questions that people want to have answered. But that's not something we can talk about yet because it's a more complex question.
I understand. I guess I would just hope our buildings are tested on a regular basis for these contaminants, and the health of faculty and students are taken into consideration and put in high regard in these situations. Sure. I thank you for your comments.
Sure. All right, next question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael. I have a couple questions, kind of hypothetical. What levels would have drawn a real health concern if you'd found them? And what are the underlying legal implications for the school or for the CSU system in general if there turned out to be a genuine health concern.
So I'll let the first question to Dr. Fischman, and then I'll think long and hard about who gets the next one.
So, you know, this is a complex, the question's a good question, and the answer is a complex one. The simplest answer is that there are permissible exposure limits and other regulatory and recommended limits that were set usually with safety factors built in, with the intention of protecting people that are going to be working in a setting for a working lifetime. So the standard that Patty mentioned for lead, it was, and she pointed out, it's the action level. So there's an action level and a permissible exposure level. The permissible exposure level is not supposed to be exceeded. The action level dictates certain things that you need to be doing for people that are exposed to that level, including air monitoring and possibly medical monitoring and that sort of thing, medical surveillance. The levels here were a small fraction. I mean, most of the samples didn't show anything in the air. The regulatory limits are based on, in almost all cases, based on air concentrations, and we're not close to that. So that's the reason why, you know, even if somebody worked in that building for 40 years and were exposed on a daily basis throughout that time, assuming that these air concentrations are representative of what was going on 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we can't completely verify that, but assuming that that's the case, one would not expect a health hazard to have resulted, or that these folks would be put at increased risk of the development of health problems, like, you know, certain cancers that can occur from high-level asbestos exposure. So we're well, as far as we know, we're well, or the university and the building is well below those established limits that are set on the basis of protecting the health of employees and other occupants. And so you wouldn't expect health risks from this. There are uncertainties or, you know, gaps in our knowledge, especially when you try to go way into the past. One other thing, you know, we know that the artifacts potentially are a source of some of the contaminants, but some of the building materials are. And in terms of the big picture, and we haven't mentioned this, I think the damaged lead paint and the damaged asbestos-containing materials are, now in hindsight, they're probably a bigger source of concern than are the artifacts, which are being handled by a limited number of people, and if they're not disturbed, they're probably not releasing a whole lot into the environment. We don't think the asbestos materials and the lead are either, but those are a bigger, in terms of volume of materials, those are a bigger source of potential exposure than are the artifacts.
Yeah, question 2, I don't think we can answer. It's a little too broad to talk about what legal implications might be in the grand scheme of things, and I also don't think it's been our focus. Dr. Wong, do you want to talk a little bit about what the focus of the campus has been?
Yeah, it is a very, very good question, but our first priority was to identify the potential health threats that were in the building. At the same time, we were trying to look at various strategies that would allow us to conduct, I'll say, limited operations in the building and resolve or remediate parts of the building in sequence. And as you heard from the health experts, one of the arguments that convinced me to close the building is that if you don't disturb it, then those particles sort of stay where they are and there's no way for it to enter your body. But the minute you try to remediate it, there was a theory about using negative pressures to move a lot of that stuff. It resulted in disturbing the material and moving it and getting it up into the air. And the consultants were very clear with me that one could not tape off areas and assure me that contaminants would stay within those taped areas as people were moving in and out of that particular area. And so what both of the professionals here have said quite clearly was that if undisturbed, there is no way to expose or to acquire a dose. But once we started remediating it, that stuff is up in the air, was my understanding from Air and Water and from TSS. So.
Okay.
Oh, I was just curious because I work in property management, and one of the companies I manage owns a lumberyard, and they found toxins and whatnot, and the first thing they asked me to do was contact a lawyer and find out their liability. But apparently you guys didn't do that.
Somebody may have, but it was not me.
Let me correct that comment because you sort of said it in a cavalier way, and it's a serious question.
Yeah.
The legal people were involved from the get-go, and they were at the table when I made the decision to close the building.
Yeah, I would think so.
And their analysis, both at the chancellor's level and at the campus level, has been and is being conducted currently.
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Sommers. I work as your gardening specialist here on the staff at the university. I've also been a student here in the mid-'70s. I earned my bachelor's degree in biology. I attended chemistry, botany, and zoology classes in that building, lectures and labs. So I have some intimate experience with the old science building for over a long period of time. I hold a qualified applicator certificate from the California State Department of Pesticide Regulation. So even though I am not a toxicologist, I'm not a medical expert, I do have some understanding of modes of entry, toxicology, chemical exposure, protective equipment, and incremental effects of toxic chemicals. So my observations are mostly for the concern of the well-being of the future of the campus and the people who may have been exposed to chemicals. I understand that the risk-benefit analysis is the legal basis for setting toxic chemical exposure standards, and it's a political expediency that we have to live with because we live in an industrial society that is permeated by toxic chemicals. And without setting some acceptable limits, we wouldn't be able to go anywhere and do anything. So it creates some boundaries to prevent overexposure and adverse health effects from these ubiquitous chemicals. However, I'm aware that there are medical experts in the field who will tell you that there is no acceptable level of consumption of mercury or lead that does not pose some potential health risks. That being said, of course, we know there's no potential positive, effects of those chemicals. And yet, to determine exactly what level might have damage for a particular person or group of people is very difficult, especially because of the synergistic effect of the 20,000 new chemicals that have been invented since World War II and are ubiquitous in the environment. So my concern is not so much in the end time static picture that you've given of the condition of the building at this present time, but my concern would be what was occurring in a dynamic sense at the time these chemicals were released into the environment. Were they in a volatile form where the people who were present at the time may have ingested them in a way that's not presently possible because they have become sediment and are now accumulated in a stable, more or less inactive form, because lead and mercury can be found in volatile airborne solutions that may no longer exist. So people who were there at the time when they were released into the environment may have ingested them and received a higher dose than anyone who would possibly go through there now could receive.
Dr. Fischman?
That is my question, but I just wanted to say I want to commend the administration for acting decisively, and some may say in extreme fashion because I believe in the precautionary principle rather than in strictly cost risk-benefit analysis, which is a political expediency, and I'm glad to see that action has been taken to ensure the health and safety of all the people who are presently here. I know it's inconvenient for people in the Department of Engineering and other schools to have to relocate, and it's very disturbing, but I am gratified that such concerned and concerted effort was taken swiftly to try and halt any further toxic exposure, and that we're taking this process to investigate all avenues of finding an acceptable solution to the problem. So I want to thank you all for your participation in this activity. I'd like to hear more about the results, and if you could give me some answer. I know it's hypothetical, but I'd like to hear some more of your insights into the possible ways that these chemicals were released in the environment and in what forms they might have been at that time. Thank you.
Dr. Fischman?
So obviously you have a lot of experience in this area, and I think you raised some good points and questions. This is a complex arena, and we can't say in the 1970s, when I guess you were a student, what the levels were exactly, but we, with help from you all, if you have knowledge about what was being done and how it was being done and what the conditions were, we may be able to get a rough estimation of what the levels were. Even though we don't know for this building, we know the circumstances in which people get sick and get way overexposed to, say, lead or mercury. Those circumstances, I can think worst case what it might have happened in the science building for. That's different than what happened in a radiator shop where they're cutting and welding lead materials, and different than a lead battery manufacturing facility. So, on the basis of that, I think it's not likely, but I'm not going to say it's impossible that somebody might have been overexposed in a significant way. There's limited things that we can do about that. Let's just take the example of lead. If somebody had been overexposed because of what they did in the 1970s, there's not much that we can do readily to try to identify what the dose was now. If somebody had been overexposed, you could measure their blood lead level now, but because lead tends to not be present in the blood for long periods of time after the exposure has stopped, it may still be in the bone or somewhere else. There's no easy test that can be done to assess what that person's exposure was before. Typically, if the lead level is okay now, the likelihood of significant effects is low, but there may be some residual effect in those people. We have talked about wanting to try to understand the non-routine, historic, or more recent activities that might have resulted in a greater opportunity for exposure. And if we can understand what they are, we can guesstimate what the possible impact would be, and then we can decide what ought to be done to deal with that and help that person if they do have a problem. So again, I think after this question and answer session, we're available to deal with things, and we're going to remain available if folks have particular concerns, and then we'll try to figure out how to assess what to do about them.
I can only tell you from my personal observations at the time that not every student in my chemistry lab class handled their waste chemicals according to best practices and policies. Though I'm not saying that this would particularly apply to lead and mercury, but their general attitude was often cavalier and careless.
And that doesn't surprise me to hear. I just want to address a couple quick things, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Again, I agree. You clearly know a lot about just the general concept of risk assessment. A couple thoughts when you were speaking and when Dr. Fischman was speaking. So in regards to mercury, it appears, it's commonly used as a measurement device. I don't know how the folks in the particular labs where it was found, how it was used, but we can go back and look at retrospectively, do some retrospective risk assessment, exposure evaluation. But my first thought when I saw that data is there probably needs to be some tighter health and safety controls on how thermometers in the engineering labs are managed, which, you know, Mr. Cortez and I were talking before that he agrees that we need to, the university is going to look into some health and safety practices.
And chemistry classes.
And chemistry classes, absolutely. And the other thought I had in terms of the challenges with risk assessment, and particularly with lead that you were talking about, or that we've been discussing, you know, in the 70s, a lot of us who were alive then, who lived through the 70s, we were exposed to lead in the general atmosphere largely through automobile exhaust because we had leaded gasoline. So that would be, just to your point of, you know, risk assessment, that would be somewhat of a confounder in terms of trying to relate an exposure in a lab setting to what it would be, you know, back in the 70s. I think in many ways we're a lot safer because we know a lot more. And I just also wanted to reiterate, given what the university knew at the time, acting in a prudent, safe way was, I think, the best thing they could do. And that's what was done. That's why we're all here now. So.
Well, I can see the university is acting in a prudent and expedient way now. There are always particular individuals who are less careful than they have been mandated and directed to operate.
I want to cut this off. I'm sorry. I want to be sensitive to your colleagues behind you. Patrick, I saw you next, and then Bruce.
Hi, Patrick McFall, Rest Life. You indicated that you're going to be doing some testing in the Murray Ward and Murray Park Hall. What are the potential drawbacks of having, or no, how would this testing affect the residents? A few years ago, in 2000, early 2000, we had to close down one of the apartment buildings because of mold. So if we find any issues in the Marys, how would that impact where students will live on campus? Will we have to go to an off-site location or not?
I guess the first step is we'll have to see what the data comes back for us to find. But I think we can at least surmise from what we're hearing from Dr. Fischman and from Patty today, is if we're looking at similar buildings, possibly similar results. And so one of the issues more likely is how we would repair those particular issues and how we would approach that. So I think one of the things now is we know a lot more than we knew back then. With the results of the impacts of the science building and how those particular issues impact our campus community. So I think we'll have some lessons learned there that we can apply. But I think the first step, and before I can answer that, is that we'll have to see what the data comes back with. But we can tell you that we've taken prudent steps to make sure that Dr. Fischman and Patty reviewed the scope, and then they'll also review the results. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Seeing that we've got 4 people in 5 minutes, and we'll take a little bit more than 5 to get through the folks in line, but I'm hoping that folks can keep their question limited as much as possible. I don't mean to do that to you, but Bruce, go ahead.
My name is Bruce Robertson, and I'm one of the displaced. My concern is, I was there on the 22nd, and at 4 o'clock, somebody came by and said, you have an hour to get out of the building, take everything you're going to need for 2 weeks. And now I'm displaced. This is my office I'm carrying with me. I need a place to work. And the issue is access to the furnishings, files, and equipment that are still in my office. I can't wait until March to create a workspace. I've already replaced some of the equipment. I need to know, is this going to be destroyed? Am I going to have access to it? And then there's the logistics, is putting it in a box in the department office. I'm going to need a truck. Or some way of, I don't have a place to put it in the meantime. So I'm just looking, what can I count on? Can you give me some hard deadlines as to what of my equipment, furnishings, and files in my office I will have access to, and what's the likely way that I will be able to get them out of there? Is it one box at a time with stickers, or will there be some point when I can come in with a hand truck?
Well, let me give 2 parts to that. I think that's a great question, because I know a lot of other people are thinking about this as well. Now that we have this information that Dr. Fischman and Patty have reported, it's my understanding the protocols that we use to allow people to gather their stuff will be reviewed and updated, and that's one of Patty's first tasks. It's it's my estimation. Patty can add to this if she like, but that there are going to be a lot more lax than they are presently with the information that we know, so that the amount of equipment and your files and things you need to teach are going to be much more accessible than they have in the past now that we have this present information. Okay.
John, would you like to add anything to that? John Kim? There's a mic there. Maybe just use the one that's right here.
I just want to make a brief comment about how faculty offices, I think a lot of people have questions about that, so I think I would use Bruce's question to impartially address that. The faculty office, there were approximately 100 tenure-track faculty in that building. There were approximately 100 lecturers in that building. There were approximately 35 GTAs in the building, so the problem is not a small one. The approach that we took was really three-pronged. One was because faculty offices are really allocated to colleges and departments, to have departments, in particular actually have colleges spearhead developing a solution within the college. Typically, entire departments were being displaced, so it didn't help to have departments work on this. It would really require something at the college level, and I believe one of the first things we did was to try to develop at the college level a plan that would work for the faculty, not an ideal plan. The second thing that we did was to keep the lines of communication open, I think, both between the colleges and other units within academic affairs, but also between the colleges and the business continuity group. So there were meetings of Academic Affairs Council and requests were made of the non-impacted colleges and academic affairs units to make resources, especially space resources, available. And I know that that is something that has been done. So just as an example, I know that there are lecturers in the College of Science and Engineering that are now in spaces that were offered by the College of Ethnic Studies. But again, that was all based on needs identified by the colleges that were impacted being communicated to other colleges and other units within academic affairs, and also to the business continuity group. And so the third thing that we've been doing is we've been developing office space, touchdown space for faculty to be able to use in Annex 2. And we are in the process of finalizing the processes by which the facility can be used, but the facility is ready to be used. And so I'm hoping that by the end of the day today or by early tomorrow, I'll be able to send an email to all the colleges so that they can communicate to their faculty the process by which they would be able to enter the facility and use the facility. I think the plan at this point for Annex 2, just so people know, roughly is that anybody who is a faculty member with an ID could go into the building. There will be a security officer there that will check for valid IDs. There'll be somebody inside Annex 2 who will direct faculty to a station that is open and help with the use of the facilities insofar as that's needed, and help direct students who are going there to try to meet with the faculty to find the faculty members in the space. There are approximately 100 stations that have been set up in Annex 2, so if there is a need, and I do know that there is a need, there are spaces there that can be used by faculty, both the ones that have been displaced and other faculty across campus. Okay.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Offer one teeny little correction, John. You're absolutely right. When John refers to using the building, I believe you're referring to retrieving your things, not actually going back in there to do research. That has not been decided, to my knowledge. Use the building is, I don't want to build hopes in people.
Yeah, so use the building in this case, I was referring to Annex 2.
Annex 2, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Great.
Okay. All right, 3 more questions and we're over time, so appreciate your succinctness.
My name is Nancy, and I've worked in the science building for 3.5 years, but work with people who have been in it for 30. And I think we pretty much feel that the exposure to asbestos is our greatest concern. And I read the report that was on the website last night, and I saw that there were extensive wipes taken, but that the air samples that were taken after the building was closed. In other words, it was not in its customary mode. So we're all wondering, I think, at what point we'll get an accurate understanding of asbestos fibers in the air itself. Is that something that can be measured when the building is not in its customary use?
Asbestos was measured in the air on really two occasions. So there was some in the AWS report of the 11th. They had done some testing, correct? That was after the building was closed, and they with the HVAC system on and people in and around the building. So without the people there, it did show that there was no detections of asbestos fibers, and it provides some level of encouragement. The additional data was collected by the company doing the remediation, Belfour. So those people actually are in the facility now, going through, cleaning up, moving papers, moving boxes. I would argue possibly more aggressively than somebody might do in their office, alone. So they're taking everything out, they're wiping, they've tested the materials, their what we call PPE, their personal protective equipment that they used, and the wipes that they used. All of that's come back negative, non-detect. And I've just summarized the data last night myself, so I could look at it all. That provides some comfort to me on behalf of those in the building that exposure in the air is minimal to zero in routine operations. The other thing that was mentioned in the report, but it's mentioned quite low, or in the latter part of the report of the AWS, is that we can't necessarily think or believe that all the asbestos that may be identified in wipes is due to asbestos material within the building. Asbestos is naturally occurring, and there are segments around San Francisco where there's noted serpentine rock present, and we're sitting on an area right now that's that the city considers there's potential serpentine rock, which can lead to chrysotile asbestos fibers, which are the vast majority of the fibers that were identified in wipes. And it's very difficult to say, is that from, how we don't, because the data, the wipe data in the report is, it's there or it's not a quantitative number of how many fibers were there. It's hard to say like how much was in the air. I really believe that there's very limited opportunity for airborne asbestos fibers from the building materials. There may be some, and there's probably some in this room right now, from naturally occurring asbestos that we all have in our shoes or our clothes or so forth. So I understand the concern. I think the exposure risk, like I said in the beginning, is quite low. And I think as more data comes in, it can be compiled and communicated. Unfortunately, we can't go back at this point and retroactively sample.
Well, we can't emulate the conditions that would occur with many students, many people moving through the building, and as you said, that disturbs the dust. But yeah. I will hope that there will be more, and I'm sure there will be, investigation into this aspect, because I believe that it's probably the most common danger to people who use that building. Mm-hmm. I also would like to give you an observation on what we experienced with articles that we've retrieved that were supposed to be decontaminated. And I read what the process was for the decontamination, and it involved wiping down objects to remove the dust from it, which makes complete sense. So we are quite troubled that both I and a coworker had retrieved articles that had very obvious dust and they had not been wiped down. So speaking only for myself, this doesn't inspire confidence in Belfour and the thoroughness of their work. And that's doubly troubling in this situation. Just an observation.
So I can address the first part of this, and I can't address the latter thing, but, you know, there's good experience that tells us the settings in which asbestos has caused and can continue to cause serious health effects. There's a lot of asbestos in a lot of public buildings, and with the exception occasionally of people who are actually doing maintenance work on the asbestos materials, the levels of exposure from routine activities in buildings tend to be, you sometimes find fibers in the air, but it's at very low concentrations, and it's not the levels at which asbestos-associated diseases are expected. There is a concern with asbestos because it's a carcinogen that low levels could play a role. And, you know, but typically building exposures, you know, from the routine occupancy of a building that has asbestos in it are not thought to be, not known to be the cause of asbestos-related diseases in those individuals.
When asbestos fibers are in the HVAC system?
Yeah, I mean, this building is not atypical. There are lots of buildings, especially 15, 20 years ago, that I've been involved in investigating where the problems with asbestos were as much or more than what has been identified in the building, including measurable levels of asbestos in the air, which is more than what's been found. And I understand the caveats of what you've brought up. So, you know, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about this. You know, I'm not trying to trivialize the concern, but I think, you know, from a broader perspective, it's not likely that this is going to result in health problems for occupants who worked in offices and that sort of thing. The people that are at higher likelihood of exposure would be the people who were repairing that asbestos-containing thermal system insulation, the pipe material, or with regards to lead, the people who were removing lead-based paint. But it's not to discount what you're saying, but I think, you know, from the experience that I've had for a number of years and from reviewing lots of literature, I don't think it's likely to lead to asbestos-related disease in the typical occupant in the building. And probably not in others, but almost certainly not in the typical occupant.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to note the Belfour comment as well and ask Michael and Ron to follow up based on that at some point afterwards. But I promised these last two folks that they would get to ask a question, and I want to honor that promise. Go ahead.
Many of you today have spoken as to the possible contribution of archaeological artifacts to this contamination problem. What I'm curious about is, given that the facilities that these artifacts were stored in have been repurposed from being chemistry laboratories to now containing our archaeological artifacts, how is the testing being done to determine whether this contamination is in fact from the artifacts or if it's due to the prior use?
I believe that the building materials and the structure itself are the primary concern here, not the artifacts. I think in the areas where the artifacts are stored, we can find some low levels of some of the preservatives, some of the metals and herbicides or insecticides that are used to preserve them, but they're not of a level that I think needs additional or warrants additional concern. I think the gentleman who asked the first question, the professor who came up, had it right on in that handling, the folks who have exposure to the artifacts know that they've been treated and there's routine methods for handling them safely. I think, it's an older building. There are some deferred maintenance issues that are needed, and I think that's really where the focus is now, not to test or remediate the artifacts. I think that would not be a prudent thing.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
My name is Uschi Simonis, and I'm both faculty in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, and I'm also the Assistant Dean for Research in the College of Science and Engineering. So, and first, just a short comment. In the chemistry department, we are doing everything to make sure that we are working safely in the laboratory. So that's my first comment. So my question now is, Research is a very important component in the teaching obligation or in the teaching venture of the College of Science and Engineering. So we take research, or we do research with the students as part of our teaching mission. So, and we have a lot of instrumentation in the building. We have a lot of faculty facilities in the building. So my question now is, it doesn't seem that there is really a risk associated with occupying the building again. So my question is, when can the faculty and their students expect to go back into the building to really kind of continue their research mission as part of their teaching?
So, President Wong?
I don't think there's an answer to that question at this time. We are trying to be as methodical as we can in gathering data about not only the condition of the building, but the effort that's going to be required to remediate it. And my understanding is that that report is still pending.
Yeah, they're actually doing the investigation.
Yeah, we're doing the, I don't know if you heard that, we're doing the investigation right now and trying to set that particular timeline. So just to be honest with you, we don't have a way to answer your question.
So there's no timeline yet when people can go back into the building to do research?
So I think I can sort of highlight what I had said before, that that's the next phase of the process, is looking at what are the next steps that will allow us either to reoccupy the building or to retrofit the building or to tear down the building. And that step is the step we're at now, but we don't have those reports. So what you're hearing today are the reports that are concluded, which are, you know, important information for us to get out to the occupants of the building, which was what were the health effects? And then also to have Vice President Cortez and President Wong talk a little bit about what next steps are, but those are next steps and we just don't have answers.
You know, I can't answer the question of timeline, but I think that the information it was important to address the health risk issue. That was priority number one, I think. Now that I think we're comfortable that in general there's not a health risk, as I think Patty mentioned, or someone mentioned, that, you know, in a systematic way we can assess what measures need to still be taken. We know more about the building and about potential hazards than what was known a month ago, and I think it makes us feel as if some of the precautions can be loosened a little bit. Exactly what or when, and the precise answer to the question I can't say, but I do expect that with Patty's assistance, we'll be able to reevaluate some of those things and hopefully make things a little bit easier for those of you that work in the building.
I'll say one last thing directed to that question too, and it's come up in a couple of other questions, is a concern for the significant research that goes on in that building. I can assure you that that's been a part of the conversation since day one. It is something that Jay Turkin and a working group is focused on trying to do, and we get the imposition. It's nothing that this group takes lightly. So it's at the forefront of our thinking, and we understand the power of that building for the work that everybody does. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for sharing your thoughts and concerns. As I said at the beginning of the question and answer period, we've got a front row of people here who have been doing some of the on-the-ground work, as well as the folks on the stage who are more than happy to take more of your one-on-one questions. So I invite you to do that as soon as, well, how about right now?